Welcome back to the TRM show. I'm your host, Dave Serafinas. Today's guest is considered a major player in the progression of travel risk management and duty of care. I've had the pleasure of working with Tim Daniel for nearly 13 years. Today, he is a coach and instructor at the Growth Academy, Widener University Small Business Development Center. He got his start at Digital Equipment, and then he spent over 25 years at International SOS. We're going to take a look at the genesis of travel risk management and go way back to the beginning. Tim, thank you for being on the show. It's nice to see you. How have you been?
I've been great, Dave, and it's good to connect with you again. Been a while, but it's awesome to see you.
So, Tim, you got your start in the travel risk management industry in the late 1900s.
Yeah, last century. Makes me feel old when I say that. But, it's interesting because, prior to joining what was, then AEA, I actually was an expat living overseas. So, I carried around a card in my wallet for probably about 6 years, both traveling and living overseas. And so I thankfully never had to use the services. And I also didn't really understand what they were until I actually started working in the industry.
How did you get into the industry back in 1998?
Yeah, I had been living in Singapore at that point for a few years, working for a tech company. They went through a merger, or I think actually they were acquired, and life changed. I wanted to stay in Singapore. They didn't think that was a good idea, and so I went on the job market. Turns out 1998 was a horrible time. We were having the Asia economic crisis then, and through a series of connections, I ended up joining what was then AEA and became International SOS in the fall of 1998.
A lot of people don't realize that AEA, or Asian Emergency Assistance, actually bought International SOS, not the other way around.
Correct. Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting story. The two companies coming together, I think it was a watershed moment in the industry, where you had a company that had very much focused on selling, particularly in the US and in Europe, International SOS to corporates, and then, a global program. And then you had AEA, which was actually founded in Jakarta, Indonesia, and very focused on establishing what I would say is an operational footprint in Asia. And sort of the two coming together to sort of combine that operational approach of AEA with the more corporate subscription approach of International SOS. But I think what's interesting here is maybe if you don't mind, we go back to International SOS, which
Sure.
was started in 1974 by a French Canadian named Claude Giroux. And I think Claude's still alive. He's probably in his 80s to 90s at this point, living, I think, in the Cayman Islands of all places, or Turks and Caicos, I believe. But he started this company based on a personal situation that he encountered, I think, in the late 1960s or early 1970s, where he and his family were in Europe. Something happened. His daughter was badly burned in some kind of an accident, and I think all their possessions got burned on this trip. And the quote that we often use from Claude is, here I was, I have all this insurance, I've got a bank account with money in it, and yet I'm helpless. Because what he realized was that at that point in the late 1960s, early 1970s, that there was this idea of assistance and there was the idea of insurance. But the two never really came together in a way that really practically helped people. So assistance kind of came out of the automobile, AAA, as we would call it in the US, but in Europe, as people started to travel around Europe in the late 1960s, early 1970s, they had these automobilist programs, like we call AAA. And because back then, it was pre-Euro, we could get healthcare in different countries, people started buying travel insurance. So Europe is really where all this started, as people started traveling around Europe, particularly for vacations and things like that. So they would join these assistance organizations, they would buy travel insurance. And that's kind of what Claude Giroux said, hey, we've got these things, but they don't really work well together. There's these gaps. And so he formed International SOS at that point. And I think over about a 10-year period, maybe a little less, he determined that, actually where the underserved market was probably with corporates, because the corporates were not going to be well served. They weren't going to join an automobile association. which really anchors you to one country. Or, travel insurance didn't make sense because that was typically being sold by the credit card companies. It wasn't really something that was corporate, it was more consumer. So he said, hey, why don't we create a product for businesses? Less about the insurance because businesses often can afford to pay for things, but they need the help to execute. So when something happens to one of their employees, how does that problem get solved? So that's where International SOS was formed. It was out of that need. And by about 1985, they had probably sold that product to a couple hundred of the Fortune 1000. So pretty successful, although still a pretty small business based in Geneva and Philadelphia. So that was kind of how International SOS started. I don't know if you want to hear about AEA a bit. I can share that story.
Absolutely.
Sure, yeah. So AEA, again, came out of a sort of a personal observation. Dr. Pascal Reham, who was a young doctor from France, was doing his national service in Jakarta, Indonesia, working at the embassy there as the doctor, taking care of this embassy staff. And I guess I assume the French visitors, French expatriates living in Jakarta. And he recognized that there was this real challenge for people living in countries like Indonesia, where healthcare standards were still fairly, I guess the polite word would be emerging. They weren't great. And so he said, hey, maybe there's a business opportunity. And so he recruited his boyhood friend, Arnaud Vessier, who was in the banking in the US at that time, and said, hey, why don't we start a business that helps people who are living in places like Indonesia, expats, travelers, get access to first world medical care. And so they actually started by opening a clinic in Jakarta. They recognized that, there's a limit to what they could do. You have to move people back to a place like Singapore to get that top rate care. And so it just kind of grew out of that. And eventually they moved the company to Singapore and expanded throughout Asia.
Thank you so much for coming on the show today, Tim. We've covered a lot of ground and really appreciate everything you've brought to the podcast. Pretty sure we're going to have you back on the show to talk about some other things. Once again, thank you very much. Talk to you soon. Thank you.